Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to have you here. We're here today for a conversation with Susan Liautaud and her book, The Power of Ethics. My name is Rachel Epstein. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty and Research at the Korbel School of International Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's event and the speakers involved. So I first want to point out that the event today is co-sponsored between the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy and Daniels College of Business Institute for Enterprise Ethics. And we have the directors of both those enterprises here with us today. But let me begin by saying just a bit more about Susan Liautaud, our main speaker, and her book, The Power of Ethics. First of all, Susan is the founder and director of Susan Liautaud and Associate, which is a consultancy on ethics that has an international portfolio. She also has high-level current affiliations at Stanford University and also the London School of Economics and Political Science in London. And she has advanced degrees in social policy, in law, and also Chinese studies. And I want to tell you that is only a very small part of her bio that I have just presented, but some of the highlights. She has an extraordinary career and huge depth of experience in the topic that she's going to discuss today. The topic that she's discussing, The Power of Ethics, her book, is timely. It's a timely conversation to have at Scrivner, also Korbel and Daniels. At Korbel, we not only recognize the importance of the topic in terms of developments in politics and also with respect to technological change, but also because our school has recently made ethics and values-based leadership a required and core part of our curriculum at the Korbel School, in connection with and cooperation with Scrivner, and one of our speakers today is actually a contributor to that course. So we're very pleased to be having that conversation with Susan Liautaud today. Helping us moderate the conversation on the power of ethics today is Kevin O'Brien. He's a professor at Daniels College of Business here at the University of Denver. He's also the chair of Daniels Business Ethics and Legal Studies, as well as the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at Daniels. And then finally, we have our own Nazneen Barma, who's the founding director and chair at the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy at the Korbel School. And she is formerly of the World Bank and the Naval Postgraduate School. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do is hand it over to both Kevin and Naz. Susan is going to speak first to give an overview of her book, The Power of Ethics. And then Naz and Kevin are both going to put a few questions to Susan before we open it up to your questions that Susan will respond to. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And thanks to our speaker and our moderators as well.
First of all, I'd like to say, again, thank you all for being here. And thanks to Doug Scrivner and to Naz and Kevin for the wonderful invitation, and to Rachel for the generous introduction. What I thought I would do is somewhat informally give you a sense of why I wrote this book and sort of what the key components of the learning are, and then try to tee up the conversation, because I very much look forward to all of your questions and comments. To start off, the overall mission of the book and the mission of my work in all the different areas in which I work is to democratize ethics. And by that I mean to give people from all walks of life an understanding of how to make ethical decisions and access to ethical decision making. And a piece of that is helping everyone, including leaders, understand that leaders have indeed a lot of ethical responsibility, but shouldn't be able to monopolize the ethics of society. We all should have a voice in key questions today. Now, 3 reasons why I think ethics have not been democratic are the following. The first is that the law lags very far behind our reality, and in particular, our technology and our biotechnology. And that gap between sort of the law over here and the reality over here is just, the space is increasing. And ethics has responsibility for that space in between, where we can't look to the law for guidance, we can't look to the law for prevention of harm, and we have to step up each of our responsibility, and certainly the responsibility of leaders, to guide our decision making. And up until now, I feel that we haven't sufficiently engaged responsibility across the board and with ordinary citizens. The second reason that I think ethics have not been democratic is that we see, and I don't know if any of you have felt this way, but we see in the news the same stories that seem to repeat over and over again. So we'll talk today perhaps about Boeing a bit. Boeing keeps coming back in the news, the opioid epidemic. It was one bank after another in the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, various forms of inequality, racially motivated police violence. And we don't have solutions for those. And one of the reasons we don't have solutions for those is that, in my view, we have not engaged broader input into the ethics of those matters. And then finally, our world has become so complex, and in particular with things like artificial intelligence and gene editing, that expertise is increasingly sequestered in the brains of a very few experts. Some of them may be in government, some of them may be in academia, some of them may be in the corporate world, for example, in Silicon Valley. But my view and my argument in the book is that we don't have to be an expert in AI or gene editing or any of the other complicated issues of today, even the political and policy issues, in order to deserve a view and in order to have a view and make a contribution. So I don't need to be an expert in AI coding any more than I need to know how an internal combustion engine works to know that I don't want drunk driving or 12-year-olds with driver's licenses. My mantra is very much that ethical decision-making tethers us to our humanity. So throughout the book and throughout this conversation, you'll hear me keeping humanity front and center. And that may be an individual, that may be urging you all to consider those who are the most adversely affected by your decisions. But we have become deeply inhumane, whether it's an assault on the Capitol, targeting individuals, whether it's racially motivated police violence again, whether it's editing the embryos of twin girls in China against all international norms, or even edging toward replacing human companionship with robots, which can be very beneficial, but which has its questions about keeping humanity front and center. The way I try to go at these questions in the book and give this access, this democratization, is in two ways. The first is through a four-part framework that is literally 4 words. It becomes a reflex for most people at the end of a 20-minute conversation or at the end of chapter 1 of the book. Those 4 words in a really succinct summary are principles, which I mean guides, not rules, not laws. And I mean your principles, not my telling you what your principles should be. So principles might be honesty or integrity or compassion, generosity, different for different people. In the days of Uber, when things went off the rails, Travis Kalanick's principles were growth and profit. The second word is information, and we all know that we need good quality information to make decisions. I'm particularly concerned in this edgy world about the gaps in information and about developing the habit of monitoring gaps in information over time, so that we're always aware of what we don't know as much as what we think we need to know or do know. Third, stakeholders. I define stakeholders as anybody or anything that could be affected by our decisions or indeed affect our decisions. Just for the sake of avoiding confusion, by things, I mean climate change, I mean policy, I mean robots. So we increasingly have to think beyond just people in terms of what influences and is influenced by our decisions. And then consequences over time. And so by that, I mean we need to consider the consequences of our decisions, short, medium, and long term, all at the time of the decision. And we've become serial short-termists. So we'll make a decision that we can live with for a couple of days, and then we'll come back and make another one. And that hasn't served us very well. So those 4 words, principles, information, stakeholders, consequences, that was just a very, very short synopsis, but they are really meant to be a habit, not something we have to memorize, not an exercise in picking your favorite philosopher. I see all over the news and all over a lot of writing, even in sort of more mainstream writing now, like things like Medium, people saying, well, what about the consequentialist view? And what about this philosopher? And, what about virtue ethics? And that's great. And that's a very important conversation in certain circles, but it doesn't serve the average person well in making good decisions in daily life. And frankly, it doesn't serve the average leader well or the average policymaker very well. The second effort that the book makes is to distill 6 forces that over many years of research and teaching and advising organizations, I have distilled into what I believe are the most important factors driving our ethics today. And what happens with those 6 forces is that you just start to see them everywhere. You'll see a news story and you'll recognize it, at least a couple of them. They become almost like when you hear a name that's unusual and then all of a sudden you see it on the side of a bus and you see it in a novel you're reading and you see it on the name tag of someone at the cashier at the grocery store. It really becomes almost like a game. I believe that they all apply in every decision we make, but we typically, in making decisions a little bit more on the fly, a little bit more efficiently, we'll quickly identify 1 or 2. And just to highlight a couple, and others may come up in conversation. The first is about banishing the binary, meaning getting rid of the yes, no, one side or the other, black or white, in or out kinds of decision making we have today, and really focusing on trying to identify opportunities and risks. So I replace, is it ethical or unethical, with when and under what circumstances should we do something. So gene editing is wonderful to cure cancer, not so wonderful if you're editing the embryos in a way that can affect the human germline. But I do say that there are some things that are binary. They are straight up unacceptable. One is racism, one is sexual misconduct, various forms of discrimination. So we do need to know where there are absolute lines. But by and large, today's challenges are very much positives and negatives, and it's a question of identifying opportunities and risks. Another one that's critically important is what I call compromised truth. Just to put it out there from the start, I do not believe we can have ethics without truth. There is no such thing as alternatively factual ethics, in my view. So compromised truth might be disinformation, it might be misinformation, it might be refusal to pay attention to information, it might be cherry picking the most convenient information, it might be confusing fact and opinion. But any variation of ducking the truth or distorting the truth is going to have an impact on our decisions. And if we think to the framework I just mentioned, in the information part, it's as simple as garbage in, garbage out. If we engage in decision-making based on compromised truth today, we will be distorting tomorrow's memory and history. So it's not kind of a short-term problem. We are embedding this problem of compromised truth in our history, in our decision-making, and in the case of the interests of many of you, in our policies and in the implementation of our policies over time. Let me just end by saying that for me, ethical decision-making and ethics in general is really about connections. It's about how we relate to one another individually. It's about how leaders relate to their institutions. It's about what policies say about the relationship between government and citizens. And in all of those different kinds of relationships, it's about trust. And I think we're at a moment in history now where, in order to rebuild trust and in order to be able to have conversations in one of the most divisive times in history, we need to be thinking about ethics as a critical tool to reconstruct these connections, to reconstruct this trust. And then finally, for everyone, but in particular for students in the audience, I see ethics is about stories. So I say to my students, how well or not so well we embed ethics in our decision-making drives our own stories, but it also drives our impact on other people's stories. And more than ever today, we have an influence on people whose stories, people, we may never meet them. We may influence their stories and they're halfway around the world, or they're in another generation that is yet to be born. So I think we need to be mindful of the reach of our ethics as well. And I think I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Susan, thank you so much for that terrific introduction to your book. Kevin and I have both read it, of course, and enjoyed talking about it. We are very much looking forward to asking you a few questions. And one of the things that's so powerful about your framework is that it has a wide and deep reach across different spheres of decision making, across the public sector, across the private sector, and indeed down to the individual level. And so Kevin and I are going to take turns asking you a series of questions that touch on the breadth of the book. And Kevin, I think you're going to go first.
All right, Susan, my first question. Boeing's leadership response with the Lion Air and Ethiopian airline crashes was to try to avoid grounding the 737s. In contrast, recently, their response to the Denver incident with 2 engines just dropping from the skies and hitting various houses, it made the decision, recommended the immediate suspension of operations of the 777s. And my question is Boeing's leadership now making better ethical decisions than in the recent past? And if so, what do you think might explain this?
So Boeing is a really, really interesting case. And let me just say that my heart goes out to everybody who's been in these terrible tragedies, and including the terrifying experience that many people had in Denver recently. And also, by the way, in Japan and Russia. Just in case anybody didn't follow this, in a nutshell, the former CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, after the second crash in Ethiopia, only months after the first crash in Indonesia, asked President Trump not to ground the planes. He literally went to the president of the United States, and President Trump said no. So did 65 other countries. Now, that decision is important because that is an example of something that I think should be binary. We have a situation where human life was lost in 2 unexplained crashes. They did not know what happened, and therefore they had no idea whether or not it could happen again. There's just no world in which that was an acceptable decision. There was no upside to that decision. Recently, there's also no doubt that it was the right decision to ground the planes, the 777s, partially because there had been, other incidents, but also even after one. It was slightly different because I think a lot of the focus is on these Pitney Bowes engines. Now, I think the key thing, though, is that the point that I make in the book about Boeing is that all of the media, story after story, was focused on this software problem, this so-called MCAS software. And I kept saying this is not a software problem, this is a decision-making problem. Now, there's no question that Boeing seems to have a leader that is very committed to restoring the ethics, but this doesn't happen with software. This happens with integrating ethics into decision-making at all levels of the organization and in all areas. So I believe that Boeing is still a risky enterprise, not because people are bad or people are unwilling, but because it takes time to re-establish the kind of decision-making that we need throughout the organization. And one of the things that Boeing reflects is one of the 6 forces in the book is the contagion of unethical behavior. And the contagion of unethical behavior is very much continues because we eradicate the wrongdoing, but we leave in place the things that drive the spreading of the wrongdoing. So we think we fixed the Boeing's, the MCAS software, but in fact, all the skewed incentives and the competition and the greed and the technology issues and the failed regulatory oversight, those are among many drivers of contagion of unethical behavior that I talk about. We need to make sure that those have been eradicated throughout the organization. And the final thing I'll say is that the FAA also had a role in the Boeing debacle by not insisting on proper oversight, by not using the Boeing expertise in the appropriate way. So we need to make sure that the FAA part of this is also fixed.
Susan, one of the sort of core overarching themes that I really took away from your book was your conceptualization of ethics on the edge. And I'd like to invite you to say a little bit more about that by asking you a question about in a context where government officials or public policy makers are faced with direction from above on a course of action that they believe to be unethical, what might be tools and approaches that they could use? And I'll just add, as I ask that question, that a number of Kevin's students are here today, as are a number of my students in the values-based leadership course at Corbell that Rachel was just discussing, that I'm co-teaching with some of our colleagues, and a number of them will be, facing challenges like this very soon in their careers as they leave and go into public policy.
Absolutely. So just to define the ethics edge, that is that space where that I mentioned earlier, where the law no longer guides us, where we have technologies, for example, but also societal risks, even things around climate change, for example, or financial system meltdown or water shortage, where the law is just insufficient to guide our decision making and insufficient to protect us from harm. And one of the biggest problems on the edge is that even if there were laws, it's very difficult to enforce them. So if you think about a rogue terrorist on the internet, how difficult is it to identify the person? And even if you can, in this borderless world that I'm calling the edge, enforcing the law, is very, very difficult. Laws are national creatures. They are spectacularly ill-equipped to deal with this cross-border world in which we live. But your question is incredible, Naz. And in fact, a year ago, I did in a public policy seminar, a unit that I called Conscience versus Country. And it was particularly focused on people who worked in the State Department or the military. And what do they do when their leaders, whether it's a cabinet position, whether it's the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and you know so much about this, Naz, more than I do in terms of all of the, but it was about what do you do? But for everybody, this is a question that is coming at us in all aspects of society. For example, Google employees walking out because Google made a huge payment to someone who was, accused of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, even worse. Google employees walking out because Google wanted to sell its drones to the US government, to the military. Similarly, Amazon walking out around things like climate change. So the question is, how do we deal with these issues? There are two kinds of issues. One is that there's real misconduct, in which case, and really blatantly unethical behavior. There's fraud, there's corruption, there's racism, there's sexual misconduct. Those kinds of behaviors need to be reported through appropriate channels. And well-run organizations should have those. And they might be an ombuds service, they might be a general counsel, they might be someone's manager, even a fairly junior manager. They might be a confidential website, but those are straight up unacceptable behaviors that need to be reported. More generally, when the behavior is legal, decision power of the organization, there we need to try to navigate. And what I advise is, first of all, we need to pick our battles. We can't fight every battle. So make sure that if you're going to speak up, or you're going to think about quitting your job, or you're going to think about, protesting, make sure that it's something that really matters to you and where you think you can make a difference. Also, we're seeing companies more and more, particularly the large companies, be willing to move someone to a different kind of role where they're not necessarily engaged in the project that they find objectionable. So Microsoft is committed to doing that, for example. If you don't want to build a certain kind of technology, they might move you into an equivalent career level position somewhere else. And then there's a question of choosing when you speak up and how. And I'm very practical about this. I would be remiss if I didn't say that that it's complicated to speak up sometimes. But on the other hand, there are ways to do so respectfully and appropriately, meaning not disrupting the workplace, meaning making sure you have all your ducks in a row, you have your information in my framework terms, and you really understand also, why your objection is so important, and you can explain what the consequences over time of your own objection would be. So it's kind of a combination of a number of different things, but I do applaud everybody questioning what they're doing at work, and my ethics framework is seamless in terms of personal life, professional life.
Susan, my question next is, your chapter entitled Compromised Truth discusses the normalization of alternative facts, which you just mentioned, giving a particularly compelling technological example of Metui, a photo editing platform in Asia that allows users to create an idealistic perception of their own beauty. When does this tool or something like it become no longer an instance of harmless fun, but a potentially harmful use of alternative facts?
So Maytoo is a little bit like, for some of you probably know about Facetune. Maytoo its initial mission was to allow people to be artistic. Maytoo means beauty basically in Chinese. The problem with it is the following. In a very, very high pressured job market, people started using Maytoo to change their photos and send in doctored photos with job applications, at least to try to get in the door for an interview. Then we started seeing the use of it for dating apps, no surprise. But then also it's an algorithm that is perpetuating particular ideals of beauty. So we have a situation where in this particular case, there's an algorithm that is sort of East Asian, and it's different for different countries in East Asia. And there are certain features that are considered the ideals in beauty. And what that is doing is it's perpetuating the idea that beauty takes one form and in potentially huge mental health consequences. At the extreme, there was a report in the UK that talked about how young people were using apps like Maytoo, getting their quote unquote improved beauty, and then taking it to plastic surgeons saying, I want to look like this selfie. So there's a range of issues from epidemics of mental health problems to the algorithm embedding these potentially racially also very skewed ideas of beauty, discrimination. But then there's also the individual. And so the question I look at here is, where does the responsibility lie? And with all the power that we all have for ethics, we also have responsibility. And Maytoo never said it was okay to use this platform to fraudulently submit photos in job applications. And where for individuals I draw the line is, are you trying to get someone to make a decision they wouldn't otherwise make? Okay. So, and that comes up in all different kinds of lying, not just this kind of app, but it's this idea that you're going to change somebody else's choice with your falsity. And then finally, we talked about the contagion of unethical behavior. This is an epidemic. There are hundreds of millions of people that use Maytoo. So much so that, for example, my Chinese teacher says that that's just the way she interacts with her friends. Everything is kind of, where she says, Maytoo'd. So this is a highly contagious situation.
Thank you.
Before I ask my next question, I just want to remind members of our audience to please submit your questions via the chat function to the Scrivner Institute account. We are doing our best to collect those questions, and we will soon turn to them. Kevin and I have a few more questions, and we'll turn to audience participation in just a little bit here. Susan, I wanted to ask you about the sort of a little bit more and probe on the public policy implications of your framework, because as I was reading your book, it was incredibly clear to me the applications of what you lay out in terms of individual and organizational decision making. I'd love to hear you elaborate how we might see your framework being applied in the context of public policy, where a core challenge often comes about precisely because of competing values. And you mentioned at the very beginning of how important sort of values and principles are. You use the word principles to the framework. What happens when you have a society where values compete with each other in terms of getting us to ethical decision making as a collective?
This is a great question, Naz, because almost every question we face today that is complicated is a situation of conflicting principles. We're seeing it with COVID. I mean, we're seeing liberty versus safety. We're seeing it with gene editing, as I said earlier, curing cancer versus huge risk by perpetuating technologies, even cheap versions of which one can buy online and potentially ultimately manipulate, the experts can ultimately manipulate the human germline. So we're always balancing these different principles, and policymakers need to, first of all, be clear about what their principles are. What kind of a society are we? What is our national identity, or the identity of our state, or the identity of our county, or the identity of our country? And then to look at things, to really pay attention to this banish the binary, to really look at things where we say, where are the opportunities and where are the risks? And how can we fight to maximize the opportunity and minimize the risk, and to make sure that we're taking a much longer term view of what the opportunities and risks are. So, an example I'll give is this recent, the Texas governor saying, take your masks off. I mean, there's no, that isn't actually, it is conflicting principles in the sense of liberty or not. But at the end of the day, we need to be, really, really clear on, the third part of this is, what are the outliers? What are the consequences that are totally unacceptable? So, distorting the human germline, people running red lights and drunk driving that could kill people, to take an example of, well-entrenched policy. So we need to be looking at these conflicting principles in those terms as well. And then finally, I would say policymakers need to get much more agile. They need to get much faster at reacting to the changes in the world. They need to get much more honest about the information, in framework terms, the information that they have, because it's one thing where we really couldn't possibly imagine something would happen. I don't know of any serious policymaker that would tell us that we couldn't possibly imagine a pandemic would happen, right? That was just policy unpreparedness. So that's another way the framework comes into this. And then finally, really, really getting more agile at looking at alternatives. We tend to look at, one idea is on the table, but, what else could we do? And maybe if we do idea X, we add, idea Y to mitigate the downside. Or, so much more agile about, almost disciplined about making sure they've always considered alternatives.
My next question, Susan, you ended your book with COVID-19 and your inspirational and optimistic mantra, ethical decision-making tethers us to our humanity. I see ethical decision-making as perhaps the greatest human connector. And just a great quote from you. My students studying business ethics this quarter embraced the notion that older, more vulnerable members of society, namely me at 69, just getting my second COVID shot this morning, should be vaccinated before their term from a Rawlsian distributive justice standpoint. This allocation rule benefits the least advantaged. The students understand that they're the least advantaged, but they understand the fairness. How can we remain optimistic and follow ethical vaccine distribution rules when vaccine tourism and VIP and immunization strategies illustrate the problem of free riders flouting the vaccine timing distribution rules?
So I wrote that, it was an epilogue because COVID was just starting when I finished the book in the final production stages. Let me just say a word about ethics optimism. I really believe that people from all walks of life, as a habit, not as a sort of a burden, can participate in ethics in all kinds of ways. In the day-to-day decisions we make in our lives that we don't think that much about, and I have a chapter in the book called Ethics on the Fly, sort of how do you do this really quickly? Also policymakers, leaders, et cetera. There's no ethics infrastructure and no societal approach to ethics that will prevent intentional wrongdoing. The best we can do is try to set up systems and set up awareness that will reveal it more quickly so we can eradicate it. And the best we can do is to understand it. And my way of understanding it is in terms of these 6 forces. So for example, we don't leave contagion on the table. We don't just get rid of the software problem. We actually fix the underlying drivers of the spreading of the problem. So those are 2 things that are really critically important. And we will have intentional wrongdoers all the time, whether it's someone who's going to commit sexual assault, whether it's corruption or fraud. But we can get much better at, as I said, identifying and eradicating and preventing. What I think about the vaccine question is, students today are having a really difficult time. A lot of them are still all completely online. It's very isolating. People have wildly unequal home environments, and whether they're navigating all online, all in class, a mix, even wildly unequal access to the internet. People with any kind of learning issue are affected even more so. Students have lost students' jobs. So I really applaud the fact that this conversation is happening and that they're thinking about fairness across society. And I would say that when we look at the potential consequences of our decision, I always argue in simple terms, but not such simple analysis. What are the consequences that are important and irreparable? So from that point of view, we are going to look at people who are in the highest risk of losing their lives. And that, by the way, when I say look at, I mean, we look at the science. We don't guess, we don't guess based on our own opinions. And we look at the people who are putting their lives on the line, who might not be in the highest risk category, but who have the highest level of exposure. Everyone from, people delivering our packages to certainly the frontline medical workers, police, fire, etc. So I applaud the fact that students are taking this broad view. And I just want to say it is really nothing short of a miracle that we have these vaccines. Hopefully we'll get them out through policy, effective policy. But we also have to keep in mind that, again, we have to do other things than just wait for the vaccines. Now, we still have to be safe, and policy will never be a solution on its own. Choice about vaccines, it's always going to be about individual actions along with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just wanted to remind everyone, I see a few people just popping in now, to please submit your questions via the chat function to the Scrivner Institute. I see a few trickling in, and we'd love to see more. Susan, I'm glad that Rachel reminded us that you are, among many other things, a China studies scholar. I had forgotten that when I first looked up your bio. And I want to ask you a question about international cooperation, and sort of highlight the fact that, as we all know, different countries, as you just noted, even different counties in our own country have different sets of values. And I wonder if you might help us think through how the approach you describe might help align stakeholders with different values on central existential challenges to our humanity, like climate change. What are pathways toward sort of ethical collaboration on something like climate change?
So climate change is one of these areas, like gene editing, like preventing international terrorism on the internet, that is literally life critical. So if ever there were issues that everyone should agree we need to address, and everyone should agree the consequences of not addressing are completely unacceptable, in my terms, important and irreparable, it would be an issue like that. And we've seen, for example, China has been has really stepped up in leadership on climate change in recent years. And China is also extremely technologically advanced and will likely make significant contributions in the development of technology to conquer climate change. But I think the key aspect of your question is whether it's climate change or other borderless challenges. One of the biggest ethical problems we have is that ethics indeed has to govern all this space. We have no global governance on these issues. And we see it in climate change, we see it in COVID, even something like vaccine passports. Who's going to decide when and how we need vaccine passports? I mean, it might be a country, it might be the airline industry, like the president of Qantas in Australia has dictated that one has to have a vaccine in order to get on Qantas flights, and is advocating that for the industry. So before we start splintering all over the place, I think we need to, the gravity of these issues will put pressure. I think also, much as we may have very different principles nationally, and leaders of sovereign nations may have different principles, for example, around free speech. We may or we may not agree with them. But here again are the principles of, we need to save the planet. Sustainability, I would think, would be a principle we could have in common. So we need to start with a principle we could have in common. The execution, better than I, is very complicated. I would just say that I'm not entirely sure our long history of these global agreements, they're good, they're better than nothing. Are they fit for purpose? Probably not. For one thing, there's no particular enforcement. So, big challenge, but I'm hoping global governance will step up along with global ethics.
Well, I think that portrayal of these sort of global governance spaces as being sort of equally on the edge, to use your terminology, is really a very important one, and a very interesting way to think about these questions. I know that Kevin has one more question, which I think will be of interest to everyone, and then I will turn to a Q&A from our audience.
Susan, in your chapter entitled Ethics on the Fly, you discuss your compelling, innovative 2x4 approach, because from my vantage point, you're really trying to integrate both utilitarian approach and then a duty-based approach. And it's so innovative the what you're doing. Was wondering if you could apply that to the bystander employee that can corroborate statements of sexual harassment directed at another employee, but likely with fear of retaliation and other negative consequences. I like to call the parade of horribles. And then an NBC News last week entitled "Pervasive Harassment." Former Como advisor says governor kissed me on the lips and repeatedly made inappropriate comments to her, including suggesting strip poker. Assuming that there's a bystander present in this situation, this Me Too situation, and of course now 2 women, since I asked you this question, have come forward as well. How would you analyze the bystander dilemma by applying your 2x4 approach?
Okay, so just since most people probably haven't read the book, the 2 plus, I call it the 2 plus 2 plus 2. Basically, when I recommend each of us developing our own principles, I recommend somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 7, not 20 principles and not 2. But by and large, when we face an ethical dilemma, 1 or 2 will really come to the fore, in the same way that, for example, liberty versus safety comes to the fore in the question of mask wearing. So pick 2 of your principles that are the most important for the particular question. Then pick 2 of the 6 forces. So the 6 forces we haven't had a chance to go into in a lot of detail, but in the bystander one, certainly there's a question of truth. There's also a question, one could look at that as in general, you know, the non-binary saying, well, look, sexual misconduct is binary. It's just totally unacceptable. But you know, definitely truth factors into that. Power, there's a force called scattered power. Power also factors into the particular example that you give, because there's such a significant power differential between a governor and members of staff. And then the third is to come back to the word I used earlier, alternative. Pick 2 alternatives or 1 alternative. How else could you handle the situation? But let me, in addition to the sort of the quick examples from 2 plus 2 plus 2, on this question, we also have to think about what is really going on here. I want to emphasize, I am nonpartisan, and I don't know what happened. There's an investigation underway, and I am always fact-driven. That's part of my commitment to eradicating compromised truth. What I would say is this: if somebody did something in 2019 that were along the lines of the accused, and again, I don't know whether it's true or false or what happened, it would be very difficult to argue that the person who took those actions did not know that they were unacceptable. 2019, we were squarely in the Me Too movement. There are a number of stories in the news that predate most of your students that are things like examples of sexual misconduct or racism that were sort of the norm, terribly so, but nonetheless were the norm, that would never be tolerated today. I mean, one example is Dr. Seuss books, right, that we're hearing about in the news. So I think we need to be really clear when we look at a case like that, that first of all, there are places to go, as I said earlier, around things like general counsel, ombuds service, you know, confidential websites, managers, et cetera, in the workplace. And I believe these women did, at least according to the stories that they portrayed in the news. But also, we need to be really clear in that information rung of the framework that it's not just about what you did know, it's about what you should have known or could have known. And every story in the book, whether it's Boeing or Big Pharma and the opioid epidemic, or these cases of sexual misconduct, almost always it comes out that people could have known or should have known if they didn't in fact know.
Thank you.
Susan, that actually provides a perfect segue into our first question, which is from Doug Scrivner. And before I ask the question, I just want to note that it was Doug who introduced me to you. So thank you, Doug, for that wonderful connection. And also, let me just note that when Doug and Mary Scrivner made their extremely generous gift to the University of Denver, which included the establishment of the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy, 2 of the things that they foregrounded in their gift was a commitment to ethics. in the public policy program, and an interdisciplinary approach to having dialogue on public policy issues around campus. And I'm very proud to say that we're manifesting both of those things with this event today. So Doug's question, as I said, relates exactly to the last point that you just made, which is that one of the challenges regarding ethical dilemmas is that people may not even recognize there is an issue before it's too late. And so he's asking for any advice that you might have on how to increase awareness and sensitivity to ethical dilemmas that we should be foreseeing, as you just noted.
That's a fantastic question. So hello, Doug. And I also add my thanks, as I did in the beginning, for this wonderful introduction and invitation. And I have to say that sort of hearing about what is going on in these various programs, I think your mission, Doug, is being very, very well executed. It's a great question. And one of the things that I do in working with organizations is to ask certain questions that are along the lines of the following. How is the world changing in ways that your organization is not? Are you listening to what people are really telling you and not what you expect to hear or want to hear or feel they should be telling you? So are you really, really anchored in reality? Because one of the things that we do is we tend, even sort of unconsciously, we tend not to see things we don't want to see. So there are a series of questions. Those are two examples. Another is, are you making assumptions? Assumptions taint your worldview and prevent you from seeing what's really going on. And assumptions can be things like, my gut reaction, or it's got to be right, or I heard somewhere, or I saw it on the internet, or there's all variation on the theme of assumptions. So I have a series of questions that I ask that are really designed to make sure that organizations are poking and prodding. And the two key parts of Doug's question that are so important are, one, that it's a proactive endeavor. So just as we heard Ibram X. Kendi say that, fighting racism is not neutral, there's no neutral in ethics. And I say that every chance I get, we have to be proactive, but also we have to question our own worldview. And the final, just very practical tip that I write about in the book and that I borrow unabashedly from both Abraham Lincoln and Doris Kearns Goodwin, his biographer, or one of his biographers, is to get our own team of rivals. Surround yourself with people who will bring new ideas, even bring new information, and poke and prod and tell you the truth about what they think is going on and also what you may be missing.
Thank you. One of the things we just covered in our values-based leadership course, Lou Griffith, one of my co-instructors, is the importance of having indeed just that team of rivals and setting up a decision-making process before you make decisions. It's the process that matters in the context in which you put these decisions together. So another question from Glenn Newkirk: how would your framework evaluate the ethics of the Biden administration's decision to avoid placing sanctions on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, after having provided direct evidence of his complicity in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey? And Khashoggi, of course, was a US resident at the time of his murder.
So there's a part of this that is international diplomacy, and that is very much needs to be grounded in ethics, but there are many factors in a complicated topic. What I will say is this, is the framework, we can almost reverse engineer a situation like this and ask ourselves, and I'll let you answer these questions for yourselves. We see what was done. What does that tell us about what our principles are and what our leaders' principles are? We see what the information is. We don't have a shortage of information in this case. As I mentioned earlier, many times we do have a shortage of information. Stakeholders, let's see what the implications for stakeholders are on this decision. Would other people be inspired, or would he be inspired to continue this kind of behavior? And finally, consequences over time. What will be the consequences? Who will get away with what? What will be the consequences of this for other policies? Will other nations follow? So we can use the framework, almost we can take a situation that has happened and reverse engineer to the framework and learn an awful lot. And I would just, this is an excellent question. And I would just end by saying, back to this point of contagion, one of the biggest drivers of contagion of unethical behavior is impunity. And that doesn't matter whether we're talking about children, and I happen to have 5, and I make no claim to, being the most sort of ethically efficient parent. but it means it's organizations, it's governments. Impunity is an incredibly, incredibly dangerous force.
Thank you. I mean, your answer there really kind of points to, as Kevin just noted, the way in which your framework combines both the consequentialist and the duty-based perspectives. Really appreciate that. Another question from Don Mayer. How can major corporations be proactive in promoting publicly minded, ethically oriented leaders in both the public and private sector? So what is the role of the private sector in helping us ensure that we have ethical public policy?
This is another fantastic question, because the private sector today, in many cases, outpaces government in resources, in control over data, in economically. So incredibly important question, given the size of, we look at companies like Amazon and Google and the like, and the power that they have. So first of all, corporations need to be mindful, to come back to this question on this, one of the 6 forces, scattered power. They need to be mindful of not just the power they wield as corporations or as leaders, but they need to be mindful of the power that they distribute to others to use. Are they giving, is social media a vehicle for terrorism, for disinformation campaigns? And what is their responsibility when they distribute this power? In the same way, what is somebody's responsibility when they distribute other weapons? So that's one thing. The second is that corporations have a real responsibility to allow citizens to do what I'm advocating here, to democratize ethics. And a concrete example of that is when you have a terms of reference, a terms of use, that is 33 micro print pages of legalese that ends in, we can be responsible no more than $100. That is not democratizing ethics. That is not giving your consumers or those who engage with you, or even the regulators, their rightful power to make good decisions. And the example I just gave of 33 single space pages is from Robinhood. But you all might want to have a look at Facebook terms of service and community standards and all that. It's a quagmire of documents and cross-references and links. And I've spent a lot of time in my life drafting complicated things, from Goldman Sachs underwriting agreements to a literary thesis on Proust, and I don't understand a word of any of it, and I'm guessing that most citizens do not.
So that's an obfuscation on the edge.
Yeah, exactly.
And so perhaps a last question here, and this one is from John Holcomb, who was Kevin's predecessor in the Business Ethics and Legal Studies Department as chair. And John asks a question about the BP crisis, which was, of course, the explosion of BP's Deepwater Horizon oil rig in 2010. And he says, as you mentioned a few earlier in the conversation, the Boeing problem was also a problem with Pratt & Whitney engines. In the BP crisis, there were 4 to 5 culprits involved, and more if we wanted to think it through. So he's asking for your thoughts on resolving ethical and legal violations involving multiple parties, and asking for your thoughts on what complications these sort of multiple stakeholder challenges pose for public policy.
This is another really fantastic question that cuts to the core, not just of this kind of a case, but it is literally one of the foremost challenges we face today. So thank you very much for this question. And it has to do with the allocation of responsibility across stakeholders. So in a case like BP, there will be a number of legal matters, some of which are regulatory, some of which come out in civil suits, or even some in criminal activity. So there's a whole array of legal consequences. Putting those aside for a minute, we have to think about, who is responsible when somebody puts something on social media? Who is responsible when somebody, manipulates, weaponizes the question of Me Too earlier? And I think what we're seeing is that it's just not so clear that the company has 100% responsibility, but it's also not clear that the users have 100% responsibility. And by the way, where are the regulators? So even in a regulated industry like BP or Boeing, the regulators, clearly whatever they had set up didn't incentivize properly. And in the case of Boeing, didn't oversee properly. And one might argue the same in BP, by the way. But we really need to think about how that this really excellent example has gotten even worse when the regulators don't understand what they're supposed to be regulating. I think they understand oil rigs, but they probably don't understand most of what's going on in Silicon Valley. And the proof of that is we've all seen, respectfully, multiple parades of Silicon Valley executives in Washington And I haven't seen a lot of output. I haven't seen a lot of outcome. I haven't seen a lot of really effective regulation that's helping reallocate the responsibility among stakeholders to the point of this really important question.
Susan, thank you so much. We've thrown a lot at you, and I think one of the things that I've learned from this conversation is just how flexible and expansive your framework really is. I mean, we've kind of asked you questions from, all around the ethics edge, as it were, and I think you've very effectively answered all those questions for us. So, Kevin, I don't know if you'd like to say something in closing, but Susan, I would just like to thank you on behalf of both Kevin and myself, on behalf of the Daniels College of Business, as well as the Corbell School of International Studies, for joining us today for what I hope is just the beginning of a conversation that we will continue to have on campus on these crucial ethical challenges and frameworks. And I hope that we will be able to welcome you back here in person sometime in the not too distant future to continue that conversation with us.
Well, Naz and Kevin, it's been such an honor, really, and thank you all for everybody who attended. It's really, really an honor and a pleasure. And I was saying to Naz and Kevin earlier, when I look at the pictures of your beautiful, beautiful institution on the website, it would be wonderful to come and see you all in person. So
we look forward to it. Thank you so much again. All the best.
You too. Stay safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.